Some albums are loved, some albums are respected, and then there are albums like Disintegration, an album that is often described as one of the greatest records ever made. But why? What makes this dark, slow, and deeply melancholic album so timeless? Why does it continue to resonate with new generations of listeners more than 3 decades after its release? Is it the music, the lyrics, the atmosphere? Or is there something else hidden beneath the surface? Because the more I listen to Disintegration, the more I realize this isn't simply a collection of songs. It's a carefully constructed emotional journey, one that slowly reveals itself with every listen. So today, we're going to find out why Robert Smith created this remarkable album, why it became The Cure's defining statement, and why, all these years later, we still keep coming back to it. When people talk about the greatest albums of all time, Disintegration is almost always part of the conversation. For many fans, it's not only the defining album by The Cure, it's one of the defining albums of the entire alternative rock era. I've listened to this record for years, but while preparing this episode, I realized something interesting. The more I explored Disintegration, the less I wanted to review it track by track. That simply wouldn't do this album justice. Because Disintegration isn't just a collection of songs, it's an experience. Every lyric, every arrangement, every production choice, and every moment of silence seems to point in the same emotional direction. Remove one piece, and you change the entire journey. So in this episode, we're going to do something slightly different. Rather than working our way through the track list, we're going to unravel Disintegration layer by layer. We'll discover why Robert Smith felt compelled to make this album, how he built its unique world, why it continues to resonate with listeners decades later, and whether it truly deserves its reputation as one of the greatest albums ever recorded. So, let's go back to where it all began. To truly understand Disintegration, we need to go back to the late 1980s. By then, The Cure had evolved from an unconventional post-punk band into an international success story. Albums like The Head on the Door and Kiss Me, introduced the band to a larger audience than ever before. They were selling out concert halls around the world, scoring hit singles, and Robert Smith had unexpectedly become a pop star. With his wild hair, smudged black eyeliner, and bright red lipstick, he had become the face of an entire generation of alternative music fans.
If you want to be one of the nonconformists, all you have to do is dress just like us and listen to the same music we do.
But beneath that success, something had begun to shift. The bigger The Cure became, the less Robert Smith felt at home in the world that came with it. Expectations kept growing, and so did the pressure to write another hit.
Everyone's just walking around like a bunch of conformists. They're all zombies racing to their graves.
Slowly, he began to feel that the band was drifting further and further away from what it had originally stood for. As if that wasn't enough, Smith also found himself questioning where he stood on a more personal level. His 30th birthday was approaching, an age that confronted him with questions about getting older, about memories, and about time itself, which seemed to be slipping away ever more quickly. While many artists celebrate reaching the peak of their careers, Robert Smith found himself wondering how much time he still had to make the album he truly wanted to make. That feeling would eventually become the foundation of Disintegration, not an attempt to repeat the success of its predecessor, not a collection of potential hit singles, but an album driven entirely by atmosphere, emotion, and artistic conviction. As if Robert Smith wanted to convince himself, one last time, that he could still remain true to his own vision, no matter what the outside world expected of him. And that decision would not only produce the defining album of his career, but the definitive artistic statement of The Cure. Robert Smith was certain of one thing: Disintegration could never become a sequel to Kiss Me, Kiss Me, Kiss Me. That album had been a tremendous success. It introduced The Cure to a larger audience than ever before and established them as one of the biggest alternative bands in the world. But for Smith, that success came at a price. The more popular the band became, the greater the temptation to meet expectations instead of following instinct.
Everyone's just walking around like a bunch of conformists. They're all zombies racing to their graves.
So when it came to Disintegration, he deliberately chose a different path. Not a collection of potential hit singles, but an album that would feel like one complete emotional experience from beginning to end. The question was no longer, which song will become the next single? Instead, it became, what kind of world do I want the listener to step into? It may sound like a subtle distinction, but it changed everything. Songs no longer had to be as short or as immediate as possible. There was now room for emotions to unfold gradually, for attention to build without urgency, and for the listener to become completely immersed in a carefully constructed atmosphere. That's exactly why Disintegration feels so different from the very first moment. It doesn't try to grab your attention with spectacle or an instantly memorable chorus. Instead, it invites you to surrender to its pace, not by pushing you forward, but by slowly drawing you in. And perhaps that was Robert Smith's most important artistic decision throughout the entire creative process. He didn't write a collection of songs, he built a world where every track serves its own purpose. Yet every piece contributes to the same emotional journey. You can hear that decision the moment Plainsong begins. Its opening minutes don't feel like the start of an album. They feel like the opening of a door. From that moment on, you step into a world you won't leave for the next 70+ minutes. And that's precisely why Disintegration is so much more than a collection of outstanding compositions. To truly understand this album, you have to experience it the way Robert Smith intended. Not as a series of individual songs, but as one continuous journey. There are albums filled with great songs, and then there are albums that only reveal their true power when experienced as a whole. Disintegration unquestionably belongs in that second category. It all begins with the opening track. Plainsong wasn't written to grab your attention with a catchy chorus or an instantly memorable melody. It does something far more important. It opens the door to the world you'll inhabit for the next 70+ minutes. The shimmering wind chimes, the slowly unfolding synthesizers, and the vast sense of space in the production make one thing clear from the very first second. This isn't a collection of individual pop songs. This is a journey. And it's a journey that has been meticulously constructed. That idea even extends beyond the music itself. The album cover refuses to reveal itself at first glance. Is it a face? Flowers? A fading portrait? The longer you look, the more the image seems to shift before your eyes. Just like the music, it doesn't offer immediate answers. Instead, it invites you to step inside and slowly discover its world. After the almost weightless opening comes Pictures of You, where the emotional heart of the album slowly begins to emerge. A little later, songs like Fascination Street and Lullaby raise the tension without ever breaking the atmosphere. Even the album's most accessible moments feel exactly where they belong. And perhaps that's Disintegration's greatest strength. The individual songs are remarkable in their own right, but their true meaning only emerges through their relationship with one another. Remove a single track, and you don't just lose a song. You disturb the emotional balance of the entire record. That's why Disintegration is so often described as an album that deserves to be experienced from beginning to end. Not because the individual songs demand it, but because Robert Smith has created an emotional journey that unfolds gradually with every passing track. Each composition adds another layer. Every transition subtly shifts the mood. And every moment of silence feels just as deliberate as the music itself. Perhaps that's also why Disintegration has stood the test of time so remarkably well. In an era where music is increasingly consumed one song at a time, this album reminds us just how powerful a carefully crafted listening experience can be. But as extraordinary as that musical journey is, one question still remains. Where exactly is Robert Smith taking us? Because beneath the sweeping soundscapes and the meticulously crafted atmosphere lies an album that is deeply personal. An album about memory, loss, love, and the inevitable passage of time. When people describe Disintegration, words like melancholic, dark, or even depressing are never far away.
Life is pain. Life is only pain.
But those labels don't really do the album justice. Of course there's sadness, of course there's loss,
Shallow life. Drowning alone, I gasp for air.
but Disintegration is ultimately about something even more fundamental: the realization that nothing lasts forever. That idea echoes throughout almost the entire album. Memories fade, relationships change, people drift apart, and even life's most beautiful moments eventually become impossible to hold on to. Robert Smith never writes about these things with grand dramatic gestures. Quite the opposite. His lyrics often feel like listening to someone think out loud, as if you've been allowed to hear thoughts that were never really meant to be spoken. Perhaps nowhere is that more apparent than in Pictures of You. At first glance, it seems like a love song, but listen more closely, and you'll discover it's far less about a person than it is about a memory, about the frustration of seeing a moment so vividly in your mind while knowing you'll never be able to return to it. It's no coincidence that Pictures of You has become one of the emotional centerpieces of the album. Those same emotions continue to resurface throughout Disintegration, each time in a different form. Close Down breathes quiet acceptance. Homesick feels like longing for something that may never return. And by the time Untitled brings the album to a close, Robert Smith seems to have accepted that some questions simply have no answers. Perhaps that's why Disintegration continues to resonate so deeply, even decades after its release. Almost everyone knows what it's like to stumble across an old photograph that instantly brings back a forgotten memory, or to revisit a place that somehow no longer feels the way it once did. Robert Smith doesn't describe those experiences literally. Instead, he captures the emotions that come with them. And that's precisely what makes these songs feel so remarkably universal. But as personal as the emotions on Disintegration may be, they would never have carried the same weight without the music. In the end, it's not just the words that make this album so moving. It's the way The Cure transformed those emotions into sound. By now, we've discovered what Disintegration is about: memory, loss, the passing of time. But that still doesn't explain why this album continues to affect so many people so deeply. Because sad lyrics alone don't make an emotional album. The real magic of Disintegration lies in the way The Cure transforms those emotions into music. Almost everything you hear seems designed not simply to make you listen, but to make you feel. Take the tempo, for example. Many of these songs unfold slowly, without any sense of urgency. They take their time to build an atmosphere, allowing silence to become just as important as the notes themselves. As a result, the album never feels rushed. Instead, it invites you to slow down. And in that stillness, emotions are given the space to surface. The production plays an equally important role. The vast reverb on the guitars, the expansive synthesizers, and the remarkable sense of space within the mix make the music feel almost weightless, as if the sounds aren't coming from the speakers at all, but are simply floating around you. It perfectly reinforces the sense of distance and impermanence that runs throughout Robert Smith's lyrics. And then there's his voice. Smith never tries to impress with dramatic vocal performances or technical perfection. Quite the opposite. He often sounds fragile, uncertain, and remarkably restrained, as if he's not singing his thoughts to you, but quietly sharing them. That's what makes the album feel so deeply personal, without ever becoming sentimental. Of course, the other members of The Cure are just as essential. Simon Gallup's melodic bass lines keep the music in constant motion. Boris Williams always chooses feeling over spectacle. Roger O'Donnell fills the spaces with subtle keyboard textures, while poor old Thompson lets his guitars dissolve into an almost endless sea of sound. Yet none of them ever tries to steal the spotlight. Every musical decision serves the very same emotion. And perhaps that's Disintegration's greatest secret. You're not moved by a single instrument, or by a single lyric, not even by a single song. You're moved because everything is constantly pulling in the same direction. As if every note, every echo, and every moment of silence is working together to express a single emotion. And that's why, more than 35 years later, Disintegration still feels astonishingly alive. Not because it's the loudest album ever made, but because it's one of the very few albums that makes you feel as though it understands you. When Robert Smith began working on Disintegration, his goal was surprisingly simple: not to reach a bigger audience, not to sell more records. Above all, he wanted to prove that The Cure could still follow its own artistic path, regardless of what anyone expected. That makes what happened next all the more remarkable. An album filled with lengthy compositions, melancholic themes, and very little concern for the charts became the biggest international success of The Cure's career. Lullaby was a major hit across Europe. Love Song even reached #2 on the American charts. And with Pictures of You, the album produced yet another classic that remains inseparable from The Cure's legacy to this day. Perhaps that's the greatest irony of Disintegration. Robert Smith wasn't trying to write what people wanted to hear. He wrote what he felt he had to write. And that's precisely why the album feels so honest. Perhaps honesty is ultimately more compelling than any commercial strategy could ever be. That didn't mean Smith suddenly became comfortable with his newfound status. Quite the opposite. As the outside world increasingly embraced him as the face of goth culture, he continued to resist the idea that music should first and foremost be treated as a product. His appearance became iconic. His image was copied endlessly. But behind the wild hair, the smudged eyeliner, and the bright red lipstick was still the same musician who would rather talk about music than about fame. And perhaps that's the most beautiful paradox of all. Robert Smith never set out to create a classic. He simply set out to remain true to himself. And in doing so, he created the album that transformed The Cure into one of the world's defining alternative bands. But success alone doesn't explain why Disintegration still holds such a remarkable place more than 35 years later. For that, we need to look at what happened after the final notes had faded away, because the influence of this album reaches far beyond the success it enjoyed in 1989. Most albums belong to a particular moment in history. You hear a few seconds, and you're immediately transported to the 60s, the 70s, or the 80s. Disintegration seems remarkably unconcerned with any of that. Perhaps that's because Robert Smith never set out to make an album for 1989. He set out to make an album about emotions that aren't bound to any particular moment in time: memory, love, loss, uncertainty, and the quiet realization that, eventually, everything comes to an end. Those are emotions that every generation discovers for itself. And that's exactly why Disintegration has continued to find new listeners, not only among fans of The Cure, but among musicians as well. Over the years, the album has become a major source of inspiration for artists working in shoegaze, dream pop, post-rock, and indie music. Not because they wanted to sound like The Cure, but because Disintegration showed that atmosphere can be every bit as powerful as a memorable chorus. Yet perhaps the album's greatest strength lies somewhere else. Disintegration changes along with the person listening to it. When you hear it in your 20s, it may sound like an album about lost love and overwhelming emotions. Return to it 20 or 30 years later, and entirely different lines begin to stand out. It becomes less about relationships and more about memory, about how quickly life seems to slip away, about the realization that some moments now exist only because you remember them. Perhaps that's the greatest compliment you can pay any album. Not that it always remains the same, but that it grows alongside you. that every new stage of life reveals another layer you simply couldn't hear before. And that's precisely why Disintegration continues to appear in conversations about the greatest albums ever made. Not because critics decided it belonged there, but because every new generation of listeners discovers, all over again, why this album continues to resonate so deeply. And that brings us to one final question. After everything we've discovered today, does Disintegration deserve that legendary status in my eyes as well? After weeks of listening, reading, and analyzing, only one question remains. Does Disintegration truly deserve its reputation as one of the greatest albums ever made? After everything we've explored in this episode, my answer is an unequivocal yes. Not because every individual song is a masterpiece, not because it's the most groundbreaking album of all time, but because Disintegration achieves something that very few albums ever do. Everything points in the same direction. Robert Smith's personal doubts, the carefully constructed compositions, the way the album functions as a single unified work, the production, the atmosphere, the recurring themes of memory, loss, and impermanence. Nothing feels accidental. Every decision serves the same emotional experience. And that makes Disintegration so much more than a collection of outstanding songs. It's an album that invites you to slow down, to truly listen, to pause for a moment and reflect on the emotions we so often overlook in everyday life. And perhaps that's why, despite its melancholy, this album ultimately offers so much comfort. Robert Smith doesn't provide answers. He doesn't try to resolve anything. He simply reminds us that uncertainty, impermanence, and the passing of time are inseparable from life itself. That's why Disintegration never feels heavy for the sake of being heavy. It feels honest. It feels human. Personally, I don't just see Disintegration as the pinnacle of The Cure's career. I see it as one of the finest examples of what an album, as an art form, can truly be. An album that doesn't try to impress through spectacle or virtuosity, but through honesty, patience, and emotional depth. And perhaps that's Robert Smith's greatest achievement. He never set out to write a classic. He set out to create a world where he could give shape to everything he was feeling. Like its cover artwork, that world never completely reveals itself. Every return uncovers another detail, another emotion, another layer you somehow missed before. More than 35 years later, we're still stepping into that world. And perhaps that is the most beautiful definition of a masterpiece. And with that, Season 4 is officially underway. This was The Cure. This was Disintegration. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What do you think of this album? And what do you think of The Cure? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to vote in the poll. You can listen to Disintegration, along with all the music featured in this series, through the Spotify playlist. For updates, be sure to check the social media pages, because I'll follow you, if you follow me. And if you'd like to discover more post-punk and new wave, be sure to check out my 10 essential debut albums of 1980. Just click the card on your screen. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time. And in the meantime, drop the needle, press play, and remember, we're only in it for the music.